What's up, guys? Thanks as always for supporting the show. It would mean a lot to me if you would take a second to scroll down and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any more of our videos. Also, make sure you follow us all over social media so you don't miss any of our content or show announcements. So let's talk about this Ant Tatum debate. So this is something I've been getting absolutely shredded for all season. And the funniest thing about it is we're talking about two spots. I had Tatum at 7, and most Celtics fans have him at 5. There are a few more intense Celtics fans that have him higher at like 3 or 4. But like the point is we're talking about just a couple of spots. I had Tatum down at 7. It was just something that Celtics fans got really upset about. I no longer feel that way. I would now have Tatum at 5. And then I'd probably have Ant even lower than 7 now. I'd probably have him closer to the bottom of the top 10. But no, it is not because Jayson Tatum beat Anthony Edwards last night. It is not because the Boston Celtics swept the Timberwolves this season. It is not because the Boston Celtics are clearly a much, much better basketball team overall, including the stars, than the Minnesota Timberwolves. That is not why I feel that way. The reason why I now have Tatum at 5 when I had him at 7 this summer is last year, Jayson Tatum was not a very good jump shooter, especially in the playoffs. And then he completely fell apart as a jump shooter with Team USA. In the playoffs, Tatum, when he took a jump shot, it was worth 0.8 points per attempt. That's really, really bad. And then he was 0 for 16 on jump shots with Team USA. So when I was thinking about Tatum in the context of the other stars in the league, I liked his versatility. I thought he was integral to the Celtics defense in that playoff run, specifically his ability to guard centers, but also to be able to switch ball screens, which was like the primary foundation of the Boston defensive scheme that caused so many problems for people in the postseason run. Huge testament to Tatum's versatility. I also thought he just did a wonderful job of initial advantage creation, like we talked about earlier, creating those tic-tac-toe situations that Boston was so good at turning into points. Jayson Tatum is a Swiss Army knife of a basketball player, which has always been something I'm drawn to because I'm a LeBron fan, and LeBron was a Swiss Army knife of a basketball player, still is to this day. But because of his jump shooting issues, I had him down at 7 instead of 5. I had a feeling he was just in a bad slump. I talked about it all summer that I expected Tatum to shoot better this year, but as I factored all of that in, I landed with him at 7. This season, Tatum is having the best jump shooting season he's had in 5 years. He's at 1.07 points per jump shot. He's at 1.02 points per off the dribble jump shot, and he's at 1.21 points per jumper off the catch. He hasn't even come close to those numbers as a jump shooter since 2020. It's been almost 5 years. And back then, he wasn't nearly the all-around player that he is now, right? So when I combine the Swiss Army knife that Jayson Tatum has been the last few years with the jump shooter that Jayson Tatum was in the early part of his career, now I do think he is the 5th best player in the league. I wanted to cover that separately because too much of this has turned into Anthony Edwards versus Jayson Tatum. I get that. I had a rant in the postseason that you guys have been pulling back all the time where I said I thought Anthony Edwards was better than Jayson Tatum. At the time, when Anthony Edwards averaging 28, 7, and 7 on 60% true shooting, dragging that flawed Minnesota roster to the Western Conference Finals, at that specific point in time, I thought Ant was better than Tatum. I no longer feel that way. But we need to remove Ant from this discussion for a second because Ant's a separate issue, and we'll talk about him in a minute. I just wanted to talk about Tatum in a vacuum. The reason why I had Tatum lower was because of his jump shooting issues. He has now rectified that, and when you combine that with his all-around ability, he is such a deeply impactful basketball player, and that's what we've been seeing this year. And that's why he is the fringe MVP candidate that he is this year. I wanted to cover Tatum separately than Ant because they aren't actually connected. So on that note, now let's get into Ant. What's going on in Minnesota right now is so much deeper than just Anthony Edwards' development. Ant is struggling right now. We talked about it earlier, but the Wolves are having these spacing issues, and they're confronting them by putting Ant with non-spacers and Julius with spacers. So Ant is playing the majority of the game with a bunch of non-shooters on the floor that teams can help off of and send aggressive help. Now, at other points in the season, when his jump shot is falling at a super high rate, it's something that has worked to a certain extent. But teams are now starting to send more doubles, more aggressive ball screen coverages, late help, all the stuff that Anthony Edwards was talking about in his post-game presser last night. And to make matters worse, Ant is now in a little bit of a shooting slump. He's at 35.4% from three over his last 10 games, which isn't terrible, but it's far below where he was to start the year. Now, here's the thing. There are two ways to look at this solution. There's the big picture, which is confronting the obvious reality that this is a flawed roster construct and something needs to be changed for the future of Anthony Edwards and the Minnesota Timberwolves. But then there's the short-term reality. And the short-term reality is that the Wolves are a second apron team, meaning they are heavily handicapped with their ability to make trades this season, and they may not be able to do much before they get to this summer. So we have to focus on the short-term reality. Because the short-term reality is this season, you got to find something you can do to make the most out of this season. Then you can confront all the issues with the roster when you get to June and July. Ant has been complaining a lot about double teams. The reality is that the best way for this team to continue is probably to let Julius keep leading those spacing groups. And Ant has to try to make the non-spacing groups work. If you put Ant with the spacing groups, those groups will be better. But if you put Julius with the non-spacing groups, those groups will be a disaster. I actually think Ant has been making pretty solid passing reads in terms of like identifying that there's a double team, throwing those skip passes, getting rid of the ball quickly. I actually think he's been doing a pretty decent job there. There are two things, though, that I think are holding him back right now. Beyond the obvious slump, which he's going to make shots in the big picture. One, his pass location, the sharpness of those passes. There are a lot of times where Ant is getting double teamed, or they're loading up in ball screens, and Ant is throwing a swing pass, throwing a pocket pass, throwing a drop-off pass, throwing a skip pass, but it's not hitting the ball handler or the shooter in the pocket. What happens there is anytime there is a slight fumble, a slight guy loses his balance when he's trying to catch the ball, anytime there's anything involving the pass being off target, it gives the defense an opportunity to rotate. Specifically, it buys them more time to rotate. And so then what happens in those situations is the advantage disappears. There were a bunch of examples last night in that Celtics game where Ant saw the right read, made the pass, but threw it off target, and Boston was able to rotate. That's a big part. I think he only had like 3 or 4 assists, despite the fact that Boston was double teaming him all night. Some of that is guys not making shots, I want to be clear, but a big part of it too is he could do himself a favor by being a little bit more precise with those kickout rates. That is a big part of how he can try to make the most out of this season, is be better attention to detail in those passes to make sure they get where they need to be on time and on target. And then 2, on defense. Ant is an incredible on-ball defender, but he has a tendency on ball occasionally to die on screens. He lost Jayson Tatum on where he just died on a screen it was like the early second half, if I remember correctly. And then off ball in particular, he stands upright and he doesn't track man and ball and he can lose shooters. How do you make the most out of those lineups? By virtue of making sharper passes so at least the guys that are limited shooters have a little bit more time to knock the shot down or to make an advantage extending play, like driving a closeout. And then 2, you have to win with defense in those groups. If you're going to have Rudy Gobert and Jaden McDaniels on the floor, you better be locking teams up. And you can't be giving up easy buckets because Ant's falling asleep off ball, leaving shooters. It's so funny because I saw so much discussion last night surrounding Ant as a playmaker. And there's no doubt that Ant needs to improve in some of those areas. Like I talked about, just little details like pass location. But I just think they're so far down the list of the other things that Minnesota could improve. And even that Ant can improve. And I just think that we're kind of missing the boat to a certain extent. The Wolves starting 3-4-5 currently makes $100 million. Jaden McDaniels, Julius Randle, and Rudy Gobert makes $100 million. That is how much of their cap they're taking up this season. Those guys are combining to make 2.9 threes per game on 33%. That's a much bigger issue than some of the stuff we're nitpicking Anthony Edwards about.